All right, back to use the voice.
What?
Use the voice.
Oh, China.
We're back. Thank you. I wish I could do this. I wish I could. Okay, so this mess, I'm gonna come back to this mess here in just a minute. Because I first kind of want to set the groundwork for talking about this, because it's actually not as complicated as it looks. So let's start off with a couple of basic things. China is, I should erase this. China is a unitary system, okay? It's not a federal system. So before we get talking about this, because I'm going to talk a lot about the responsibility of local governments and all the autonomy that they have to do different things, don't be mistaken. Don't think that this is some kind of federal structure like in Germany, where you have all these different states and it's their collective agreement that gives power to the central government. That is not what's going on here. It's not a federal system. The United States and Germany are federal systems. In China, we have another unitary system, like in France, like in Britain. It's a unitary system. Power is in the center, and they distribute out what they want. So if a province, or whatever the case may be, has the prerogative or power to do something, it's because the central government said, we're just going to have you do that. Okay? This is, I mentioned the administration of their social welfare benefits. The central government essentially said, this is going to be really expensive. We're just going to kick that ball over to you. You take care of it. So, these are the major provinces here. Okay, we have all these different provinces. There are 22 provinces, and then there are 5 autonomous regions, 4 autonomous municipalities. These are basically like your really large, millions of people live there, urban dwellings. And then you have your special administrative regions here, right down here. They're so small you can't even really see them. These are interesting because they get to elect their own executive. It's not president, but it's like their head of government, their executive. The executive executes the laws. That's supposed to be the role of the president, actually, is to execute the laws that Congress makes. It's not quite how it's turned out, but that's how it's supposed to be, and that's what's going on here. And then you have autonomous regions, like Xinjiang and Tibet. So the provinces form sort of the highest level of Chinese administrative division. Think of it like state governments. But again, don't think of it as federal. But if you want to think of it as like, here's Ohio, and here's Indianapolis, and here's Indiana, and here's Minnesota. And then within these provinces, there are further breakdowns of government, right? So think of it as like provincial governments, and then regional governments, and then local governments inside of those regions, inside of those provinces, which are all inside of China. So, the big difference between the provinces and the autonomous regions is the autonomous regions have a lot more legislative power than in the provinces, although this is something that varies. As I said, Xinjiang had a lot more regional autonomy until the early 2000s when Beijing decided that they were problematic, and so they restricted those rights. Again, these are not rights that it's not that the center got its power from the agreement of the states, it's that the center is delegating authority and power to you and then saying, actually no, we're going to take that one back now. So, lots of central direction. A lot of it comes in the form of unfunded mandates, though. You guys are familiar with unfunded mandates, right? Here in the United States, right? Washington says, hey, all of you guys need to do this. This is a new standard. It's coming from the federal government. The Department of Education, for example, makes a ruling and says, hey, from now on, this is the way we're doing stuff. Now, it's up to you to come up with the money to do this stuff, all you states. And then there are funded mandates where the federal government will say, okay, we want you to do this thing and here's some money, right? So a lot of this in China is unfunded mandates. The central government in Beijing is saying, hey, do this, and then it's up to you to find the money to do it, okay? So these are the basic building blocks of the Chinese political system here. These provinces here, these 2 special administrative regions, and then our autonomous regions here, okay? Okay, So, and there's Shanghai right there. Bustling big port city there. Okay. Oh, I'm gonna go back. Yeah, I'm gonna go back. Okay. So, I typed this out, and then I'm going to go over to our beautiful PowerPoint slide here and attempt to walk you through this, because it's actually not quite as complicated as it looks. Essentially, I'm first going to write this out on the board here, and I'll tell you what, I'll use red for the CCP, and I'll use black for the state. So I'm just going to have party on this side, and state right here. Okay? Because what we essentially have here is the Communist Party, which has different levels, different structures, different councils, different components, who essentially also run the state apparatus, which has its own levels and departments and councils and different things. So we have like the standing committee, we have like multiple standing committees, but one of them is inside the Communist Party, and one of them is inside the state government apparatus. So when we get to those, I will make sure to clarify which one that is, but just so you know, the Communist Party runs things, but there is a parallel organization. The party has its organizational structure, the state has its organizational structure, but it is the party that governs the state. That is why here the Communist Party is above everything else. Okay? And as Roskin notes here, China's 1982 constitution specifies that everything runs, quote, under the leadership of the Communist Party of China. In case there's no confusion there. The Communist Party of China runs China. Now, really quickly before I do this, I'll just say this really quickly. There is a National People's Congress. This is part of the state apparatus, the National People's Congress. I'll tell you about what it does in a second here, but I'll just knock this out right here, because it's actually fairly straightforward. National People's Congress. That was that great picture I showed you earlier with the hall, the people in it. So here's all the seats, right? Here's all the seats. As you can see, the CCP dominate, right? They've got all the seats, right? All these seats. And you say, well, but Professor, I thought it was a one-party state. What's all these other parties? These parties are largely ornamental. These parties exist at the toleration of the CCP. And all of them, in their party platforms, say explicitly, our number one goal is to support and assist the Chinese Communist Party in governing China. So they take the term loyal opposition to a whole new level, right? If they are not a loyal opposition, they literally will be banned and cease to exist. So yes, there are other parties, but they literally exist under the watchful eye and under the toleration of the Chinese Communist Party, with the explicit understanding that they are there to support and buttress the party's rule, period. I'm not even going to go into who they are, because they are totally irrelevant. And these seats right here are actually for technocrats. There are a lot of like technocratic like advisors who they don't have like a technical party affiliation, but China is a very bureaucratic and technocratic state, right? They don't have if you look at China's leadership, he mentions this, like, you've never seen so many engineers in your life, right? They're all engineers. So this is it. This is the National People's Congress. And then they don't convene all the time. Most of the time, there's what's called a standing committee. The Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. I'm going to write the whole thing. I'm just going to abbreviate them. They have no real power anyway. They're a rubber stamp. But basically, there's a lot of people here. 3,000 people. They don't get together all that often or for all that long. There is a standing committee of like 127 or 160. Well, yeah, I don't know. I think it's 127 who are permanently there, who just, rubber stamp whatever is coming down the pipe, whatever initiatives are coming down the pipe. So that's the National People's Congress. Again, it's largely ornamental. at various points, there has been more or less robust beginnings of debate, but really, especially in the last 10, 12 years, really none. It's really just a rubber stamp. So the National People's Congress, the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, that's just the smaller group that's always there. So, okay. Then there's the regions. Again, a lot of things are just delegated down to the local government. Hey, you need to take care of the people's welfare, the hukou system, for example, the hukou system. And that's very expensive. And they finance that, again, primarily through land sales, which, remember, are more like land leases. So, here we go. Let me read right side down. So, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is the ultimate authority in China. It controls the state through a hierarchical structure where party leadership dictates governance. The General Secretary, currently Xi Jinping, is almost always the President of China, Chairman of the Central Military Commission as well. So what does this mean? They're the President, that's the head of the state. So you have the President. You have the General Secretary. And then, I guess I'll put the PLA separately. The PLA is totally subordinated to the party, the PLA, but this is the PLA. As you know from your reading, that stands for People's Liberation Army. And then the PLAN is the People's Liberation Army Navy, which tells you historically where they ranked in bureaucratic importance. The PLA, there is a chairman of the military commission. Yes, central, the chairman of the Central Military Commission. These are held by the same person generally. So yes, there is the illusion of this diffuse, complex-looking structure, but really, there is one person who has control over all of these things, and it is Xi Jinping. Has been for 13 years, and it will continue. Barring some, probably like personal accident, because there is no obvious successor. And you know, I'm a China watcher. I listen to a lot of good China commentators. I mean, they say there's virtually no risk of a coup coming from inside the system to get him, and there's virtually no risk of a popular uprising. I've read several people who believe that if there was a free and fair election in China today, that Xi Jinping is popular enough that he'd win. So, you know, but I'll get into the reasons for that too. To some of its optics and some of its policies. So, the Politburo are the leading members of the Communist Party, right? So we have the Communist Party, which has many millions of members. I think it's at 90 million members or something like that. 90 million members. You have this kind of elite group of policymakers who are in the Politburo, okay? Of the Politburo, there's a standing committee. There's a standing committee. This is made up of, it used to be 7, but now it's 6. So you have your standing committee, the standing committee of the Politburo. And then you have the Politburo itself. This is where the actual policy debates happen. Because there are factions within the Communist Party, like I told you about. And there's an old saw about China and its policymaking, which is in China you can't change the party in power, but you can change the policy. Whereas in the United States, you can change the party that's in power, but you can't change the actual policies. So that's where a lot of the debate used to happen. It used to be, kind of like a well-balanced clique who debated these things, especially at the level of the standing committee. It's really only in the last about 10 years that Xi Jinping has really consolidated his power over the party that you've seen an elimination of those kinds of policy debates and more of, I wouldn't say like one-man rule, but certainly there is not that kind of previous debate among mostly co-equal colleagues. That's just not the way it is anymore.
The joke, I'll back up a little bit. The joke when these guys were in power, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, the standing committee would show up to things, and foreign leaders would be like initially unclear about which one was actually in charge. It's not the case with Xi Jinping, right? No one's confused about who's actually in charge. So that is a big change. So these bodies, the Politburo and the Standing Committee, these are the decision-making bodies of the Chinese Communist Party. They set the policies, which are then executed through the government bureaucracy. So they are the ones who basically present stuff to them, and they say, great job, guys, those are phenomenal thoughts. We love those. Now we're going to get those implemented through the bureaucracy. And this is, like any government bureaucracy. You've got people who run an education ministry, you've got people who run a defense ministry, communication, all those different things, right? State ministries and bureaucracies are all basically the same. It's just a bunch of technocrats and people, government officials, who go implement the laws and statutes that have been put into effect. So it's not too terribly foreign to ourselves there. You have your townships and provinces who are getting handed all this stuff. You have your courts and prosecutors. The armed forces, that's really their own thing. It's completely under control of the party. The courts and prosecutors, yep. I'll say a couple things about that in just a second. So, let me just say something about the state council here. So the state council, where do I put this? Where do they put it here?
The state council grows out of the national people's time.
I'll put it right here. So the state council, this is kind of like the equivalent maybe of like the standing committee of the Communist Party, but this is actually headed by a premier. Now his job is he's not the head of government. The head of government is the president. But it's the premier's job to actually run the government, if that makes sense. Like, they're the ones who actually have to put the policies into effect and make sure things are actually running correctly, right? They are not really concerned with managing the party or the military. Their sole job is to make sure that the things that are getting passed through here are getting executed by the bureaucracy. Under Mao, for example, we said Mao was the longest of the rulers. Mao held this role, which is more about coming up with the governing philosophy and managing the party and controlling the military. And then I mentioned Zhou Enlai. He was the technocratic premier who set up the bureaucracy and tried to govern the policies and different things. Really tried to restrain some of Mao's worst ideas, although he wasn't always terribly effective at that. He did save Deng Xiaoping's life, though. Let's see. State council, the military and judiciary. The military under the party control, not state control. The state does not control the military. The party controls the military. The judiciary is also under CCP oversight. You basically need to be a party member to get any of these positions. And that's why opportunism, like, if you're not a member of the party, like, good luck, right? Like, it's not that private business or things like that, like one famous guy, Jack Ma. Have you guys heard of Jack Ma? He created Alibaba. You guys know Alibaba? Okay, Jack Ma, right? So like, it's not impossible to be rich and successful in China without being a member of the party, but it's very difficult. It's very, very difficult. And so, a lot of these really great secure positions here, you have to be a party member. Now, a little bit surprising, there are some aspects of democratic procedure in the system. At the village and township election level, now, mind you, the CCP are largely going to win these elections. It's largely party cadres who are going to be voting in these things. But there is some amount of selection, although there are local election local election managers to kind of make sure that candidates who are undesirable don't get in. It's kind of like what happened in Hong Kong there, where you had an objection to a certain candidate being in office, because the idea was, yes, you can choose your own executive as long as they are not anti-Beijing's control of Hong Kong, if that makes sense. Hong Kong was ceded to the British. Hong Kong, that wonderful little island there. Hong Kong was ceded to the British as part of the First Opium War, the treaty. Now, eventually, they negotiated a treaty that said, look, we're just leasing it, really. And our lease will expire in, was it 1997 or 99? I'm getting confused because the Portuguese had the same thing with Macau, and Macau and Hong Kong got returned to Chinese sovereignty in 1997 and 1999. I'm forgetting which one took place in which year. I believe Hong Kong was 1997. And part of the deal was, we're going to have one country, two systems, meaning that you can keep your more freewheeling capitalist financial hub where you vote for your executive and stuff, as long as you don't do things that are going to be contrary to Beijing's desires, essentially. So there's been a lot of controversy about that, a lot written about that, but just, you know, there are a lot of different things like that that are contested. So yes, there are elections at the village and township levels, things for like village committees, local leaders. They technically, non-Communist Party candidates can run, but in practice they almost never win. These in turn then will vote for representatives to higher bodies at, let's just call them the regional level, and then the provincial level. So think of it as like a really restrictive franchise. Think of it almost as like the old British system, because we talked about how the British democracy was in some ways so stable and never had a French Revolution style event because it evolved so slowly. Because what happened? Well, initially, you just had some small landowners in each district who could, I'm just going to pretend these are districts, and you had a few people in each district who could vote, right? And then they would get together and vote for people in this larger, provincial district. And it was a very limited franchise. We only had a handful of people who could vote in each one, and they would send people to higher and higher levels of government. For example, in the early American Republic, in our own example, you could vote, let's say you lived in Massachusetts, which had a very liberal franchise, you could vote for your congressional representatives. But then they would vote for who would be your senators. There was no direct election of senators until the 20th century. So it's kind of like that. So you'd have like a property restriction, and then there'd be like another property restriction for so here's the property restriction for, you have to have this much property to vote, and you have to have this much to stand for office. And then once you stand for office, it's only those elected people who will then vote to send people to higher and higher levels of government. It's kind of like that. But that is not to say that power is growing up through democracy in the system. Remember, it is not that way. Everything is coming down in the unitary Chinese system, and it's coming down specifically from the Chinese Communist Party. So, they like to call it, what is the word they use for it? They like to call it a responsive democracy, meaning that it's not a procedural democracy, meaning no, we don't let the people vote for who's going to be the president of China and stuff like that, but we are constantly listening for what the Chinese people want. And once we know what they want, we, the smart technocratic experts, get together and best figure out how to get them what they want. So you could say a couple things about this. You could say, one, well, if you take a charitable view of it, you can say, okay, they're trying to govern in the general good, maybe. But I think another way you could look at it, the more realpolitik way, is, well, if people are unhappy with your rule, they're more likely to be rebellious. And if you want to stay in power and keep milking them for money and goods and power, you should keep them quiescent, right? Satisfied, not upset. So if they're complaining about environmental degradation, you should get someone down there to, you know, take care of whatever it is. And there are a lot of protests in China. Now, individual dissidents do tend to get locked up, and there's a lot of lawfare. I talked about lawfare earlier. Especially, like, let's say you're a lawyer, and someone wrote some sort of incendiary article, and they're in trouble. And you go represent them as their lawyer. All of a sudden, you're being charged with tax evasion. And now you're being disbarred and jailed, right? Now, again, so something like environmental protest, which is like not political, it's something in Eastern Europe, even in the commie states, like they would allow environmental protests because it was seen as like not political in a way that the regime could say like, we hear you, we're responding to your needs here, we are responsive to you, we represent you, and a lot of the same stuff is happening there. There's been a lot of effort to clean up Beijing's environment, which was really, really trash from its crash industrialization in the 1980s and 1990s. Yes, that's China's state system here. Here it is. So here's Xi Jinping right here. He is the general secretary. He's also the chairman of the Central Military Commission, right? And he's done a lot of purging of that. There's been tons of anti-corruption, tackling the top of the Chinese military here and replacing them with loyalists. Of course, he's also in charge of the Politburo Standing Committee, the Secretariat, and there, of course, tied in here, the Central Committee, and then down here is the National Party Congress. So as you can see, the policymaking process is very tightly restricted here, and by the time it gets down to the National Party Congress, all the debates about the policy have already been settled. Yeah?
Going back to that, like, lawyers not representing without repercussions kind of thing, is that kind of what happened with, you heard of, like, Jimmy Lai?
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of what happened in his case? Like, he was kind of, I don't really know the whole story, but he was, like, in jail for a while. Wasn't really...
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a pretty clear, I mean, obviously there's always going to be a lot of propaganda on all sides about this, but I think one thing is very, very clear, and I'll throw it out here, so I think this is a pertinent point to make. Where's that black one? This is a good one. Okay. You, the people, be politically quiet. Don't get involved in politics. If you stay out of politics, we will give you a better material existence. And that's it. So you can say, well, what did he do? What did he actually commit a crime? There's no rule of law in China. This is not a country governed by rule of law. It is rule by law. It is you use the law to punish people who threaten the regime. So, a better material life. Look, frankly, if you were to go to China as a tourist, which you can do, you would not even notice, really, that you are living in a one-party, quote-unquote, communist dictatorship, because things are modern and happening, and the lifestyle is quite rich in a lot of the cities. As you move inland, it gets much poorer. It gets much poorer. Economic development and incomes are very unequal across China. One of the big pushes, and I'll talk about this here in the end when I talk about China's current challenges. But if you're in the big cities, Shanghai, Beijing, all those things, it's indistinguishable from like New York City or Chicago. It's very rich, it's luxurious. These people, in their lifetimes, went from a per capita GDP of $900 a year. In the year 1999, this was per capita GDP in China. That's how much money you made in a year. This has gone up by 10 in the last 25 years. By 10. Imagine if American incomes had been, imagine if your income or your parents' income, or I don't know how many you have jobs. Imagine if in your lifetime, your parents' income had multiplied by 10. That's crazy, right? That is a crazy elevation in the standard of living. And so, of course, most people are happy to be politically quiet. What would you change? What would you change? Look at that. What are they supposed to do? They are cleaning up the environment. They've made you way richer. They're making China proud and prosperous and a leading country among the nations again, getting our respect back. For most Chinese, they are politically inactive. They view a lot of what happens in the state, actually, as kind of being like a joke. Like, they don't actually think that the state is governing things and that these parliamentary procedures actually matter. Like, most of them view politics very cynically, know that, like, the state party organs, the state papers, that, like, their propaganda and stuff, they just don't care because they're busy getting rich. They're busy getting rich. Their grandparents were starving in Mao Zedong's labor camps, right? Perishing by the tens of millions. Their parents were living lives akin to like what an industrial worker in a Charles Dickens novel was dealing with, right? And they're living lives now, 2 generations removed, not that different from ours. iPhones, luxury material goods, all that stuff. No fear of starvation. And again, if you aren't involved in politics, you have no reason to fear the government either. So, but if you are getting politically active, then you have every reason to fear the government. Especially if you live in one of those autonomous territories, or if you live in one of those special administrative districts where Beijing's control is less firm than it is in the more central provinces. So that's why they're very sensitive to things that happen in Hong Kong. That's why they're very sensitive to things that happen in Xinjiang. And of course, they're also increasingly concerned with how they're viewed on the world stage. I thought it was very telling, right, as the Biden administration was leaving, it was in, I want to say September or October, they had their final meeting, the Biden team and Xi's team, and they basically laid out this list of demands, and they basically said, look, from here on, we don't want to hear any lectures from you guys about our human rights or anything like that. You know, it's insulting to us. We're tired of you criticizing us and meddling in our internal affairs. You know, you murdered your indigenous population. You know, leave us alone, basically. We're just not going to put up with that kind of criticism anymore. So they're very conscious of their image internationally. That's why they're very concerned with casting people who they do persecute as being corrupt or being involved as a foreign agent, right? When someone's causing political trouble, let's say he was in the pay of some, NGO or whatever. And sometimes that does turn out to be the case. So, what are the issues in contemporary China? Aren't things going great? The party's done a great job, right? Well, a couple things. Demographic collapse. China had a lot of people starving. They were producing way too many people, so the regime thought. So in the 1980s, they had a swell idea, and this was called the one-child policy. Well, what happened is you set yourself up for demographic collapse down the road. He talks about this in your book. Hold on here. He talks about this. Okay. I know he talks about it here. It's one of the biggest problems that they're facing here. Yes. So, number one, have population collapse. By 2030, about a fourth of the Chinese population, which is about 1 billion people, a fourth of them will be over 65, and there will be only 2 working Chinese for every retiree. It's a problem here, because they're the ones paying the welfare benefits, right? Just like our social security system. It's one of the arguments for people who want more mass immigration. They say, look, the native birth rate isn't high enough, and we're not going to be able to support our retirees unless we have more young working age people paying into the system. because spoiler alert, all that money that you paid in Social Security, they spend it, right? Intending to tax other people later to pay your benefits. That's how all of these systems work. China's no different. But because their government has highly restrictive interventionist policy, they've caused a huge problem for themselves. Huge demographic collapse. It also led to a sex imbalance. Because people could only have one kid, what'd they do if they had a girl? They would abort this baby girl. So there are tens of millions of more young Chinese men than there are women. Yes.
What's the ratio, like you said, 2 to 1? What's it here? Do you know?
Ours is 2.1 something. We're just above the rate of replacement.
Okay.
So we're just above the rate of replacement. China is well below the rate of replacement, and have been for your entire life.
Okay.
Because Xi Jinping, I was going to get to this, but Xi Jinping in 2017 or 2018 was like, okay guys, never mind, have 2 kids. We at least need to replace our population. Unfortunately, this has not happened. And the reason for this is because China is urbanizing. China is urbanizing. And there is a phenomenon that happens when you urbanize. It doesn't matter if you're in China, or the United States, or England, or France, or anywhere. Once your people move off the farms, children cease to be an asset. Extra hand on the farm, after all. If you're from farm country, you know this is true. In the city, what do children become? An added expense, right? And you gotta pay for childcare. You're working in an office, and you have smaller spaces to live in. People have fewer kids as they industrialize. It's been true in every single case that we've seen across every nation, every state. The population goes down, the birth rate goes down as you industrialize, as you urbanize. And so, having spent 30 years intentionally choking off the population, Xi Jinping reversed course and was trying to figure out how to help people have more babies, but they don't want them. They don't want them. They're more interested in living the life of, an urban bourgeois person, which is not having tons of kids for the state. That's just not what they want to do. They want to go out there and have fun. They want to, grow their careers and things of that nature. So, population collapse, huge problem, huge problem. And like I said, in terms of internal social stability, that sex imbalance is huge. There just aren't enough women. Think about it. You're going to have tens of millions of guys who just can't get a girlfriend. And look, I know that sounds funny and whatnot, but you just think about it. Economic downturn happens. All of a sudden, you got a bunch of restless, unemployed guys who can't find a girlfriend. That doesn't sound like a very good idea. I'm putting my regime hat on, and I'm thinking about how to control the population, and I'm thinking that is a bad idea. You don't want young men between the ages of 18 and 24 around anyway. They're always troublemaking, and now they got no job and no girlfriend. This is bad. Got to figure something out. This is one of the best arguments the hawks have, I think. The people who say, China's dangerous, we need to fight them, blah, blah, blah. I think that's one of their best arguments, is that if the economy took a crash or something, that they would have a huge incentive to just throw some of these tens of millions of extra dudes they have into a war over Taiwan or something like that. It's a decent argument. I mean, obviously there are other arguments to be made, but managing the neighbors. China has tons of neighbors, tons of neighbors. It's a very difficult relation. You got the Korean situation on the peninsula, which I'm not going to get into. That's complicated, and that's tied into the Cold War and all those other things, the war against Japan. You've got India. They just had a fight. They just had a fight with India, was it 2 or 3 years ago? There's a disputed area. China has boundary disputes with a lot of its neighbors, and this Chinese patrol and this Indian patrol came upon each other, and they had a huge melee, and a bunch of people got beat to death. The Chinese and Indians also fought an extended border war back in the 60s as well. So that could be a problem. It's a very, very tough neighborhood here. They have a lot of neighbors. Places like the Philippines and Indonesia have quickly growing populations. Vietnam is becoming an economic competitor on their doorstep. You have Japan with the historical animosity and the large U.S. military presence there. It's just a tough neighborhood, and it's very difficult to manage all those relations. We have enough trouble here in the United States managing our two pretty good neighbors, honestly. They're nothing as difficult as what China's doing. continuing to grow the economy. The S curve. I know your book has mentioned this, but there's an actual statistical curve that most economies follow as they develop. And it looks like an S, hence the name, easy to remember. First, you're not growing very much. You're an agricultural economy that's got low capital investment and low total factor productivity growth. Then, you have a takeoff period where you're applying mechanization, you're urbanizing, you're getting a more literate population, you're accumulating capital, you're investing in technologies, and whoa, growth is going great. But then, you do all that building all the roads, all the railroads, linking everything together, automating your factories, industrializing, electrifying everything, and now the growth rate starts to slow down. This is called the maturation. During this growth period, countries can go from like 8% to like 12% annual growth. It's catch-up growth. You're getting all the easy stuff. Once your economy matures, so that growth rate is going to slow down a lot. We're talking between 2 and 3% a year is considered a good clip. A good clip there. A lot of maturing economies don't even grow that fast, especially when you account for inflation. If you subtract the rate of inflation, a lot of economies barely grow. So, that's a problem. Continuing to grow the economy because China's had very uneven economic growth. As I said, if you live in one of the coastal areas, yes, you've got many, there's like over 1 million millionaires in China, you know. Of course, there's 1 billion people, but you know, the economy has grown a lot, it's raised their standard of living, but in the interior of the country, that just drops off a cliff. Kind of like here, right? If you're in the Beltway, going down that track there, but then you jet over into, or you're looking at me this way, you duck into the hills of West Virginia, how we doing? Is it similar? No, right? It's not even close. So China's the same problem. And so there's a debate about how to level them up, right? And Xi Jinping is very concerned with this, his Chinese dream, right? His Chinese dream program, which is to raise the standard of living of these people, right? Managing relations with the United States. This is a big one. I'm not really going to get into it any more than I already have. There's a copy of that book if anyone wants it. Also, the library here has a copy if you want to read about it. Roskin talks a little bit about the economic interdependence, which is very complicated but important to understand and appreciate when you're thinking about China, which is 326. 326, I'm sorry. Managing its international reputation, I already talked about that. Building Chinese power and influence abroad. China now is the largest trading partner with the majority of countries in the world. China has become a critical part of all supply chains. This has been huge for China's economy because part of what has helped them raise the standard of living of these billion people is being able to give them good paying jobs with constant demand, right? And so spreading those trading relationships, subsidizing state companies, keeping foreign companies out, it's one of the reasons that the business lobby in the United States has kind of soured on China. For 30 years, it was the business community who was leading the charge that we need to have better relations with China because, oh my gosh, there's 1 billion Chinese. Imagine if each of them bought 1 gallon of our oil, right? And this is something that if you go back and look at British imperialist thinkers, they were talking about the China market. If only those 1 billion Chinese would each buy 1 square of Lancashire cotton, we'd be rolling in it, guys. So the China market, it didn't materialize for them, and it hasn't materialized for American corporations either, because the Chinese government kept American producers at bay. Had a lot of restrictions. Cultivated domestic champions using technology that they generally. So that's one of the funny things is like they say like, yeah, they stole the technology. So a lot of the technology was like given to them by US corporations who were trying to win access to the China market, not really thinking that, oh, well, the Chinese are actually just going to build duplicates and then keep them out of the market permanently. So that's one of the reasons the business community today is very about China. They're more interested in trying to get Washington to engage in protection for them. The biggest thing now is corporations are worried about their supply chains in China because so much stuff gets made in China. So many supply chains. It's one of the things Raytheon, the Senate hearing, they were like, yeah, we'd like to get out of China, but we really can't. And like, these are the guys who make the missiles for the U.S. military. It's like they're really critically reliant on Chinese suppliers, and so that was like the whole thing. And so now they're trying to reshore. So there's outsourcing and offshoring. They're trying to reshore or friendshore. That means put the factories in countries like Mexico or the United States. Resolving the Taiwan question. This is something that's really gotten tied into Japanese nationalism. There is not really an emphasis on Maoist thought anymore, communism, anything like that. It is, they call it socialism with Chinese characteristics. Now, no one is really fooled by other things. It is state-directed capitalism with one-party control. It's very similar in a lot of ways to what you see in Japan. It's not exactly the same, but it's similar in a lot of ways in terms of it's very reliant on exports for its economy. There's a very high domestic savings rate. They underconsume in terms of domestically compared to other countries. They buy a lot of U.S. treasuries, a lot of securities with that trade surplus. And in the case of China, one of the things that really rallies the people around the regime, apart from the economic growth, is that it was the Chinese Communist Party that ended the century of humiliation, made them rich and powerful, and made them respected. A big part of this mythology is the Taiwan question, because it is the last piece of China that was taken by one of the imperialist powers away from them and kept from them by them. And so resolving the Taiwan question in the way Beijing wants is seen as completing the project of Chinese rejuvenation, which Xi Jinping has said will be completed sometime before the year 2050. So he would like to do it before he leaves office, he has said. As I said, it's not clear when he's going to leave office because he's given himself another term. No one's had a third term. They were really studiously careful in the years after Mao not to allow any single individual to dominate the way that he did and create a cult of personality around himself. Xi Jinping has very much bucked that trend. It's going to be interesting to see what happens in the coming years. Obviously, relations between Washington and China have not been worse in our lifetimes. So it's a very curious situation, one with a lot of variables and a lot of uncertainty. I strongly encourage you guys to at least be aware of the Sino-American relationship. It is the single most important relationship in the world. So that's all I have for you today. If you don't have any questions, I have 3 minutes left if you have questions. Question away. Very well then. The quiz is up and available. I will see you next week for Russia.